Teresa.
Hey,
Hey, how's it going?
good. How are you?
I am doing well. We are in goodness gracious, I don't know, hour three of the Jesusathon, and it's been a great time. So, everyone, if you're not already familiar, my dear friend Teresa Pasquale is a trauma specialist. She's a contemplative practitioner and action teacher. Is the author of Sacred Wounds, which is a book that just came out about spiritual trauma and church hurt. I'm going to put a link up here in a second. You should check it out if you haven't already. She's on the leadership team for the Transform Network, which is this awesome network which helps connect other networks and communities to create movements for social change and transformation. So, welcome, Teresa.
Thank you for having me. I saw my leadership team from Transform colleague Robin over here just a few minutes ago.
That's right. We did. We had Robin on twice, actually.
Nice.
Yeah. So I would love to hear, your expertise is this sort of nexus of contemplative practice, activism, and trauma. And that invariably forms, I would imagine, your perspective on Christology. So how do you see your work, and particularly in Sacred Wounds, maybe, interacting with what you've had a chance to digest from the Homebrewed Guide to Jesus?
Sure. Yeah, so many thoughts. There's reading through the text, what I was able to read. It's interesting because I think coming myself from sort of a very socially liberal but Catholic family, I forget how much of the unpacking of the mystical, of that space of unknowing, has to happen for people that come out of more fundamental or conservative evangelical vantage points. And so every time I read, kind of the kind of content like what you wrote about, Tripp, it reminds me of how much there is to unpack, and that it seems like a lot of what you're doing in the book is breaking down and sometimes quite like kind of like punch in the face, like there's a moment of a phrase or sort of just kind of disrupting or disturbing old theologies and old Christologies by putting things out there that to me in my relational experience with God is almost intuitive, but I realize people don't learn what I realize is people in more fundamental traditions don't learn spiritual intuition. And so in a way, it seems like what you're doing is unpacking the language around the thinking, because so much of evangelical tradition is brain first, God knowing, versus heart and spirit first, God knowing. And so it seems like there's a lot of that unpacking of the brain first knowing so that people can almost be prepared to sit in that space spiritually, which I think is it's a whole other learning.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good observation. And you didn't know this, but Mike did. That one of the whole sections that got moved when I, first doing the book is more emphasis on Jesus, the historical Jesus, and that kind of thing, which ended up having to collapse a lot of the later chapters, which get to more kind of cosmic, mystical, and that type of understandings of Christology. And at first I thought, I could have made the book 3 times as long. Because I like writing and reading myself. But there's that problem. But the other part about it I get is something you said, that and I'm kind of telling my experience as a very Protestant person, in how when these kind of log jams of spiritual imagination get broken by Jesus, by the historical Jesus, by dealing with the text, by doing that, then it actually opened up to this rather rich spiritual relationship to God. One of the stories that would have been in the larger one was actually this moment where, and I talk about in the book, where the historical Jesus kind of breaks this rather shallow image of Jesus I was trying to protect. And at the same time is when I discovered Meister Eckhart and contemplative prayer. And if one of the things in reading back through the book I would want to say stronger is how you come to lack an anxiousness around not knowing the answer yet and pursuing it when you're able to rest in the presence of God. And as you come to see that as this Christophonic space, then I think it can inspire a lot of creative reflection theologically.
Absolutely. And like you said, enter into that mystical space, because some of, speaking to the sacred wounds and the research that I did a lot, getting stories and kind of just listening to people, and many of them coming from evangelical, more fundamentalist backgrounds, it is the idea that God is in the word, right? So God is in the thinking. And the problem with that is kind of what you're saying, is that, when God, what I found was when God is in the thinking for people, then to get rid of the things they know is like taking away the God, So it's like a breaking down of the way that they understand God. And nobody's taught them yet how to understand God in their heart and their spirit. And so there's this frantic, particularly as people are breaking away from tradition, it's this frantic space. The unknowing is terrifying because it feels like it's godless when it really isn't. It's just thoughtless.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. Because I think it's in chapter 7. I don't remember. But I talk about how Elizabeth Johnson, when she's developing this kind of cosmic eco-feminist Christology, emphasizes the radical solidarity of God with all flesh and the deep incarnations, the concept she's developing. And she highlights that God doesn't become human like anthropos. God becomes sarx, materiality. And how odd is it for us, right, to think we are being distanced from God when our understanding, the words and things are being deconstructed, when the whole gospel story is God getting materialized and coming to dwell right in the dirtiness of things. And even one of the things the mystics emphasize, like the resurrected Christ still has the wounds. That's the very place that is near and dear to God, are these materialities, these hurts, these pains. And that is it requires a certain type of, what would be the phrase? I don't know, to think that seems reasonable requires a breakdown of your inherited theology that isn't, I don't know, I haven't figured out a good way to describe it. So how would you describe the turning point in one's kind of spiritual journey and reflecting about the tradition, where it turns for being a kind of defense and learning and articulating ideas to the ideas being kind of like one of the energetic places that kind of spring forth life and that kind of stuff?
Well, and I think for most people, and one of my teachers, Richard Rohr, always talks about this, but he says all transformation comes through pain. Mm-hmm. So I think, unfortunately for all of us, there's an essential painfulness to the process. That I think the point of breaking through is really also often the point of breaking down. Now, for some people, that may just literally be that they've broken down the text and their thinking space so much that in itself can feel like a falling apart. But for other people, it can be just radical suffering experience in the world. So sometimes that's injustice, but oftentimes it's a personal experience of some kind of hurt, suffering, oppression, injustice that is too big for a God that's made only of thoughts to mm-hmm. fit, or to be with, or to sit with, that we need to break open to a space where it's not about God who gives me the answers, the information, the thinking stuff, but rather it's God that sits with me in relationship. The way I talk a lot about relationship with God in this kind of way of like, if it's transactional, if it's constantly like my thought about you and then how I think you think about me, and then I pray to you and I think that you respond to me, and it's transactional, that's an unhealthy relationship. That's a dysfunctional relationship. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of times that relationship has to break down entirely, and it doesn't work when we experience real suffering. It no longer works, no longer holds. And then it has to break through to a relational experience of God. And really, Jesus is the embodiment, the Christology. That's the embodiment of the relational experience of God. Like you said, mm-hmm. beyond knowing the information of God, it's the experience of being in a relationship. Jesus embodied that for us. And that's really the full expression of God. So I think hurt often breaks through to that understanding of God as a presence with us rather than a thought to help us understand.
Yeah, and I think one of the genius moments in 20th century Christology is the reverse, that the same is actually true for God. One of the radical parts of Christian theology is that God embraced the wounds and trauma of existence into the divine life. Right, like the contemplative teachers have taught this from our end, and this Christological affirmation is like, no, it's reciprocal. Like the pathos, the passion of God is one where this love becomes vulnerable to our finitude, our brokenness, and risks loving in this deep and rich way. And the synchronicity of those two is beautiful, because God does that in order to reveal the love of God for us in the world, and we have to go through pain and process it to come to understand and receive the love of God. How odd would it be for Christians to think that it would just be done in the level of the abstract in the head on coming from both directions? It would be dysfunctional, and it would also be way too common, right? Like, I think that's that's one of the biggest challenges facing the church, is our temptation to just not go there.
Mm-hmm. And that's the true nature of relationship. So the true nature of relationship is reciprocal. So if we are an iteration of God in the world, and all of our relationship is not one-sided, but it's reciprocal, then it's, once you get to that place of understanding God as a relationship, then it's almost, it has to be both ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it strikes me that when I consider both of your works, Tripp coming in this book from a perspective that God is like Jesus, and you, Teresa, coming from a perspective of contemplative heart, that you're both making a very definite statement about God that I think is different than the sort of either moral therapeutic deism or Calvinism, in that you're saying that being with God relationship with God is inherently vulnerable, inherently reciprocal, not only on our parts but on God's part, kind of making that move.
Mm-hmm. And this is actually exciting. So you don't even know this, Mike, but at the Homebrewed Christianity live podcast at Infolding Spirituality in a couple of weeks, I'm going to interview Teresa about her book, and we're even going to throw a little party for its arrival to the universe.
That's awesome. That's the perfect time to plug. Yes, Infolding Spirituality. It's coming up in just 2.5 weeks, something crazy like that. It's going to be a party. We're looking at these, contemplative and radical Christological dimensions. We're looking at the impact of spiral dynamics and integral theory upon Christian faith and spiritual formation. I'm throwing up a link right now if you want to check out the Infolding Spirituality. It's going to be a lot of fun.
And for me, it's a beautiful intersection point of where we are right now in faith, because the hatchery who's throwing this whole thing together comes out of the, Spencer Burke, they come out of the evangelical side and moved into progressive evangelical and are now offering, I think this is what's deeply needed right now, are these conversations around what is God, what is Jesus, that sort of embodied, that leads to the mystical, the contemplative, and the healing dimensions, because that's where people are at. They may have broken down, there's a whole network of people, there's a whole large, wide body of people who have broken down the thought and are now desperate for the ways, the access points into that relational God.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and what I really like about the event, one, for sheer nerd purposes, is that Don Beck's going to be there, who's kind of like the pioneer of spiral dynamics, and I have a stack of questions that may have existed and gotten longer the last 10 years. But one of the questions I'm most excited about is seeing what is it like for our students at the hatchery to attend a conference having kind of started this alternative way of even doing theological education. So there's the academic masters of theology type stuff that I'll be facilitating for 4 hours this afternoon, realizing now that means I talk for 9 hours. But what were they doing this morning while this is going on but contemplative prayer? And what is it like to do theological education where it's like one part is developing a community of service in your community, another doing contemplative practice, and then doing a theological education. That's kind of the unique adventure of the hatchery. And I'm excited of going into a conference having been framed by that type of rhythm, because that's just not the normal one. As you can imagine, I would be just as happy talking about German idealism for the next 5 hours as anything else. So I'm super thrilled that Teresa's going to be there. Mike's going to be there.
Yeah, I'm going to be there with the organization that I work with called Presence. I just threw up a link to that. It's presence.tv. We do work with spiral dynamics, integral theory, and the biblical narrative. And Doug King, the president of Presence, will also be sharing. So it'll be a great time. And at the moment, we're actually at a pivot point. So we're going to bring on our next guest. So thank you so much, Teresa, for being here with us.
Enjoy your marathon chat.
All right. Looking forward to seeing you in person soon.